everyone, thanks for joining me again today. So in the last couple of videos we've talked a bit about bees and how we can encourage them into our garden by providing nesting habitats or lots of flowers for them to feed on. But today we're going to focus a bit more on their behaviour and why it's really unusual and really interesting and fascinating. So one of the most remarkable things about bees is the way that they often live in these colonies or in the hive, and they all work together for the good of the colony, it seems. And that seems quite nice, to be honest. It's quite altruistic, quite selfless. But if you think about biology and if you sort of know a bit about the basics of evolution, you'll realise that there isn't really a place for nice in when it comes to evolution. It's all about the survival of the fittest. All individuals are sort of competing with each other in an effort to try and pass on their genes to the next generation, regardless of what everyone else is doing. So how on earth did these colonies of bees, and also wasps and ants, they're all part of the same family, the Hymenoptera, how on earth did they evolve to cooperate and be altruistic like this? And actually this was a real problem for Darwin. He spent a lot of time pondering this because obviously his theory of evolution was all about survival of the fittest and things competing with each other. So it kind of was a bit of a thorn in his side. He didn't really know how to explain it. What he couldn't have known is that actually a lot of it comes down to the genetics of the bees. And it's actually, they've got a very unusual genetic system which kind of makes them favour cooperation. So today I'm going to explain a little bit about how that works. But first of all, we're going to think a bit about how most animals sort of reproduce and how their genes are passed on between the generation and how relatedness kind of works. So we'll set the scene and then we'll explain why bees are different and why that means that they often form these colonies and seemingly work together. Okay, so let's think first about the majority of animals, at least ones that reproduce sexually. So you have obviously a male and a female, and they will mate to produce offspring or eggs. So each individual has two sets of chromosomes, which means we have two copies of each gene, and these copies can vary. It's called alleles, so there's different versions of the same gene. And the combination that you have of these alleles is pretty much unique to you. And you inherit these from your parents. So you see the little blue and red stripes and the purple and green stripes. These are representing different versions of the same gene on each chromosome. So each of these X's will have a complete set of genes, but with different variations, and they'll have the same set of genes as each other, but the variations will differ. Okay. Now what we often think about is, we get one set of chromosomes from our father and one set from our mother. So that's indicated here. So in your offspring, one of your chromosomes comes from your father and one comes from your mother. And obviously you'll have a set of these. So in humans there's 23 sets of chromosomes, so there'll be 46 of these in total, but we'll just think of one pair for now. What often people sort of overlook is actually, this would make it look like this chromosome here is actually exactly the same as one of these. But that's not the case. So before the chromosome gets put into the sperm or the egg, there's kind of a bit of a shuffle that goes on, a bit of a random assortment. So a lot of these alleles on these chromosomes will switch places, which means that this chromosome actually has a different combination of alleles to either of these. And that's really important when it comes to relatedness. So when we talk about passing on our genes, what we're really trying to do is pass on our specific combination of genes. Okay, so you've got this combination from your father and you've got this combination from your mother. So that means that half of your combination of genes comes from your mother, half comes from your father, which means you're 50% related. You share half of your genetic material with your mother and half with your father. Okay, so compared to the rest of the population, you're half related to each of your parents. Okay, so let's think about brothers and sisters then. So they also get one set of chromosomes from their mother and one from their father, or your parents if they're full siblings. But because of this sort of random assortment that goes on, the combination that they get from their mother and the combination they get from their father is not the same combination that you get. And that means that you're less related to your siblings than you are to your parents. In fact, you're 25% related to your siblings and half related to your parents. This means that ordinarily, the best way to pass on your particular combination of genes is to give it to your children, the next generation. And in most animals, they spend their whole lives trying to produce as many offspring as they can to pass on that combination of genes into the future, into the next generation. Occasionally, that might not be possible. For some reason, you might not be able to have children, or for example, in birds, if your nest for a particular season fails, it gets predated and all of your offspring for that season get eaten, and there's not time to produce any more. It might favour you to help raise your siblings, because at the end of the day they're still more related to you than the average Joe in the population, and sometimes that does happen. So for example, in long-tailed tits, they're often in groups. They pair up to breed at this time of year in the springtime, but if their nest fails, what they'll do is each one will actually go back to their family group and they'll help their brothers and sisters to raise their offspring rather than trying to raise more of their own in that particular season. So they're kind of partially cooperative. You'll also get animals and birds in different countries, particularly where the conditions are really, really harsh, where it's not physically possible for a pair to raise offspring in those conditions. So what happens is you end up with helpers. So things like meerkats and living in the desert, you've probably seen documentaries about them. They live in the family group and they all help their mother and father to raise the next generation. In Australia there's a lot of birds that also do this because the conditions are just so harsh, particularly in places like the outback, that a pair of birds couldn't possibly raise a brood of chicks on their own. They need help, and actually it's in the interest of their other offspring to help them do that, because they can't raise their own offspring on their own as well. So it actually favours cooperation. But generally it is more beneficial to you to raise your own offspring than to help your siblings. So that's what's the normal case, that's what normally happens. You're half related to your parents, you're half related to your offspring, and you're 25% related to your siblings. Okay, so that's quite a lot to take in. So we're going to take a very short break, so you can watch a bee buzzing around, sort of relax, take it all in, and then we're going to talk a bit about what is different about bees. Okay, so hopefully that's given you a bit of a chance to sort of get your head around how genetics works sort of in terms of inheritance in most animals. Okay, so if we think about bees and wasps and ants, so the Hymenoptera, they're very unusual because they have a system of genetics called haplodiploidy. And what this means is that the males only have one set of chromosomes. So the females, so for example the queen bees, she'll have two sets of chromosomes like most other animals. But the male, the drone, only has one. And this means that the relatedness between individuals in bee colonies is completely different to most other animals. So let's think about this now. A queen bee in the sort of late summer will mate with a drone, and this is basically the same as most other animals. Then the next spring she'll lay those fertilised eggs and they will hatch out into her daughters. So those daughters will have half of her genes and half of the genes from their father. So they'll still, the relatedness between mother and daughter is still 50%, just like normal animals. However, the relationship and the relatedness between the father and the daughter is greater because the father only has one set of chromosomes, so there's no mixing that goes on. All of the chromosomes he has gets passed on to the next generation to his daughters. Now because of this, because half of their genetic material is exactly the same, if you're talking about daughters and then their sisters, it actually means that female bees are far more related to their sisters than to their mother. And that is why it makes more sense for them to help their mother to raise more sisters, so sisters are more related to them, than it does for them to try and have their own offspring and mate. So let's just go through that again. Each daughter gets half of her genetic material from her mother and half from her father as normal, but the half that she gets from her father, for all of the workers, all of the daughters in the colony, that half from their father will be exactly the same, and because of that they're 75% related to each other. Okay, so that half that they get from their father is identical in every one of those worker bees in the colony. So they're going to help their mother raise more sisters because they're the most related to them. Okay, so then that's all fine, and because of that, that's why you get these sort of harmonious colonies. So you've got all your worker bees, all the daughters, helping their mother to raise more female offspring. That's all fine. However, what it also means is that a female bee, regardless of whether she's mated with a male, can produce and lay fertile male eggs. And that is because a male only needs one set of chromosomes. Obviously a female has already got two. She puts half of her chromosomes into an egg and it will hatch out into a male. So if we talk about a son here, you can see that one of those chromosomes has gone into that. Now this means, and the relatedness actually between a son and their mother is much higher because all of the genetic materials in that son is exactly the same as the mother. They've just taken half of it. So the relatedness between a mother and a son is 100%. This means that later on in the year, the worker bees, and this is especially true in bumblebee colonies, it varies slightly in other colonies, but in bumblebees there's this conflict sort of late in the season because the workers will start to try and lay male eggs because at the end of the day they don't have to go and mate to do this, and it's in their interest to lay male eggs because they're more related to them than their sisters are. So normally what happens is the queen bee, the mother, will actually suppress her daughters from doing this. So in theory they could do this at any time, but she produces a hormone which stops them from doing this. It stops them from laying those male eggs. But at the end of the season, the queen bee, the mother, needs to lay male eggs of her own, and also the new queen's ready for the next season. And she can't produce that hormone to suppress her daughters and also lay male eggs of her own. So what happens is that hormonal suppression of the workers ends, and then there's a full-scale revolt. So all the daughters will try and eat their mother's male eggs, they'll try and lay their own male eggs, and eventually they actually kill their mother. They'll completely overthrow the colony. They'll kill their mother, they'll lay their own male eggs, and then they'll hatch and they'll fly away. So you've got what seems like a very altruistic thing going on, and that is because of this relatedness. But later in the season, actually, there's still that conflict that we see everywhere else. These societies aren't quite as harmonious as we might think, and yeah, they actually overthrow the queen so that they can lay their own male eggs, which and then pass on their genes to the next generation because those sons are going to be more related to them. So that's a bit about why the genetics of bee societies predisposes them to working together and being altruistic, but why you still get conflict in those colonies, and they're not necessarily as peaceful and nice as they might initially seem. So the concept I've just explained to you is called kin selection, and it was proposed by a guy called Hamilton. And when it was first proposed, it was kind of seen as the answer to cooperation. It's a very neat explanation for how it might have evolved. However, as the years have gone on, scientists have discovered other things which start sort of making you doubt whether this is the only reason for cooperation in these insects. So I'll just explain about a few of the caveats right now. So the first thing is that Hamilton's rule, or kin selection, relies on this increased relatedness between the daughters or the workers, which makes it favour cooperation, so they want to help raise more of their sisters. However, this relies on them all having the same father, so it means that the queen can only mate with one male. And actually genetic studies have now shown that this isn't always the case. Sometimes the queen will mate with multiple drones, which means that all of her workers or her daughters aren't necessarily 75% related. And maybe the reason for that is that she wants to reduce the relatedness so they're less likely to try and overthrow her later on in that conflict that I mentioned. It's also worth pointing out that that conflict where the workers do sort of eat the queen's eggs and then eventually kill her is mainly found in more primitive cooperative insects like bumblebees. In more advanced societies like honeybees and also sort of ants and wasps, that doesn't happen as much, and perhaps one of the reasons for this is because they have a caste system within their colonies, so different individuals within the colony are actually physically different depending on the job that they do. So you've probably seen images of the soldier ants, which are much larger than their sort of worker counterparts, and they defend the nest against intruders. And perhaps those castes have evolved to try and reduce this conflict because maybe they physically can't reproduce. So there's lots of different caveats, and that's one of the great things about science. You think you found the answer and then there's an exception and then you have to look into it more and do more research. But it's very unusual, this genetic system in the Hymenoptera, so the bees, wasps and ants. So it's very likely that it does play a role in cooperation, but there's probably also other factors at play. So yeah, I hope you found that interesting and you've enjoyed it, and yeah, we'll see you again soon. Thanks, bye.